and welcome to the show. It is your floor. I'm interested in what we had a little pre-conversation just for a minute or two before the show, and we threw some ideas across. So Ben, tell us about your trip, grains, and everything else.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Dave. I really appreciate it. So, I guess the place to really start with all of this in terms of distractions is, of course, the big thing today, the Kavanaugh hearing. And I'm not trying to go super in depth with that right now, but I have multiple videos on the right media talking about this, but this is a political stunt that's garnering huge amounts of airtime. And I wouldn't say that it's meant to distract from anything, but it's certainly distracting regardless. And I mean, that's been the big story of the last 2 weeks. And there's still been no solid proof. It's being drawn out for obvious reasons. But anyways, beyond the Kavanaugh hearing, there's also a fairly respected petroleum geologist and oil analyst named Art Berman. And he's talking about how crude oil supplies will soon move back into a surplus. And there's a reason that Trump wants to up the oil production, which has increased substantially since Trump took office. But the U.S. stores the second most barrels of oil in the world. You know who stores the most? China. And I'll elaborate on China a little bit more later. But this is a push as we enter a period of increasing food prices, which is happening. I mean, I'm looking at a graph right now out of The Economist showing how food prices have been rising since around 2000, 2001. And granted, they fluctuate a lot, but determining the high point of food prices is generally pretty difficult because it's a multi-factor system. It's pretty complex. But on top of that, the average food prices are the highest that they've been since the global food price crisis in 07, 08. I mean, the price of wheat in Australia is at a 10-year high due to horrible growing conditions, and they have an estimated 38% loss of wheat production in the middle and eastern territories. And then you come over to the US. In the US, there are 4 huge wheat producing states that have seen a decline in the last few years. That would be Texas, Minnesota, Montana, and North Dakota. And this is largely because of frost early on in the growing season after the wheat has started to sprout. But I mean, even with seeing that more growing areas are going offline, we do have to keep in mind that the graph of how much food can be grown on a certain amount of acreage is constantly growing. Technology is constantly getting better. I mean, humans are innovators. They're not just, mouths to feed. They're also minds that can innovate. And there are some easily identifiable problems with the farm industry. I mean, don't get me wrong. One that I would certainly point out is farm subsidies. I mean, this is driving farmers to grow corn for ethanol, even though they're paying the farmers more than it's worth to the market. And that's just to make it worth it for the farmer's time. Basically, there's a huge amount of loss. And it's the kind of cycle or the system that if it's iterated through enough times, it will result in collapse of the industry. And I mean, if you talk about, the collapse of the ethanol industry, that could even be the economy as a whole, because it'll affect far more than just ethanol. But another aspect to consider is that this land is being used and its resources are being pulled, and it's being pulled for ethanol and it's not being used for food. But if ethanol wasn't subsidized, then it probably would be used for food because it would make the farmers more money. And then another issue with farming like that is that it's ruining the topsoil, and it's killing the living organism that is the soil. Because I mean, dirt is just crushed rock, sand, dead organic matter, but soil includes the bacteria and the fungi living that produce the nutrients for plants. And when you monocrop, when you pull the same nutrients from the soil constantly, this leads to massive crop shortages that people don't really foresee. Companies don't really foresee it. In fact, the Black Plague in Europe was said to have been preventable with beans. And the reason that people have said that is because people during that time were largely malnourished. And it was because the crop growing was terrible. And what they failed to do was plant legumes, because legumes replace nitrogen in the soil, which is necessary for so many other crops to flourish. But they didn't do that. They had the crop shortages. People had just destroyed immune systems, and then the plague was able to spread like, well, the plague. But that's what happens when these crops are planted in the same place every year. They exhaust the soil. And I understand that farms are going for efficiency. I understand the whole industry is trying to be more efficient, and that's why there are farms that produce food that monocrop. But there has to be then some manual replacement of the nutrients to the soil. Otherwise, I mean, everything will die and it'll turn into northern Africa, where they wrecked the topsoil hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. So, I mean, my main complaint here in all this is how the crop production has been pretty much led off a cliff by subsidies and poor management, but also you can't discount the colder temperatures, specifically above the 45 degree latitude mark, which I experienced quite a bit of my trip. And I can touch on that a little bit more later. But the last point that I want to make is that even though Oregon, Washington, California, Montana, all those states in the West, the Northwest, that are really producing massive amounts of crops, it's not natural. I mean, you can drive for hundreds of miles through dead shrubbery and dead grass, and the only green that you'll really see is usually a perfectly square patch of land with one of those giant watering machines parked in the corner, or in some cases currently watering the field. And the water is brought into the fields. The rainfall in these states would not allow the food production to be near the level it's at without the artificial watering. And I mean, just in general, really, aquifers out west are being drained faster than they're being replenished. And I'm not saying it's a crisis situation yet, but it's not sustainable. And collecting rainwater collecting rainwater is it's a great alternative. And I think that there are certainly more people looking to go that direction. But doing some research on it, I found something that was kind of interesting. And it's most likely sterile, I'd imagine it's sterile. But for every raindrop to form, it needs to begin by bonding to a piece of dirt or dust. Like, the chance of a water molecule bonding to another water molecule just on its own is so incredibly small that I think it was estimated it would have only happened like 4 times in the history of the universe, or the history of the earth. I mean, it's so small. But if you collect a lot of the rainwater and you run it through a filter system or something, I mean, that could prove to be a short-term solution. But again, that's more for households. It's for personal use. When it comes to watering huge fields, the water's going to run out, and it's not coming from the sky quite enough. So, I mean, like I was saying, I saw this firsthand about a month and a half ago when I was out in that part of the country. And I got plenty of pictures to it too. I mean, the farms are they're largely artificial out there. So I guess that's good for an opening bit.
Yeah, let me toss a side thought in there with you as well. You were talking about the prices of grains haven't run up this much since 2007 and 8. But we have to remember what happened in the Middle East during that time. Food price rises, especially in Egypt, for the prices of wheat were the catalyst for the governmental change. And then we saw that Arab Spring sweep through largely the other countries in the Middle East, all based on food prices as well. So you have to wonder, with this next cycle 2.0 of rising food prices in the Middle East, there will be no dictator to lash out the anger at. So I'm wondering what politically is going to happen, because the food prices are going to rise. That's just a given. So if you're trying to work out a mathematical formula of, you have an A and a B plus C minus D divided by E equals, well, the A is for sure going to be rising food prices, whether you like it or not. And that's the reason I do my channel, is to try to explain why our crops are being lost through 400-year cycles in the sun, and then it's going to push food prices. So, Ben, what do you think about the Middle East coming up? What happens if we get 2.0? But imagine if the food prices double over what they were in 2007 and 8 that caused all the civil unrest. Imagine double or triple prices, what caused the dictatorship regime changes all over the Middle East. But imagine now the price is even higher than that. Where would we go?
Well, actually, I kind of covered that in a video I did a little while ago, talking about the anti-human movement. And there's something really interesting about famines around the world that I've started to notice. And I think that when you have food prices rising, government is inevitably going to try to take control of industries and socialize industries, or, hand out massive subsidies, like try to alter the system in some way. And government is the last entity to get involved in any food or energy concerns. They're the last entity you want involved in any of that, because they run it horribly. The most damage has been done to the environment when the government decides to start initiatives and programs to save the earth. They've done the most damage to food when they start handing out these subsidies and then cutting the legs out of other areas of the industries, and they're pretty much just left to flounder, and they're propping up systems of business that can't function. They're not self-sustaining, so it just constantly feeds off the taxpayer. I mean, think of the alternative energies like windmills. Windmills take so much diesel fuel to lug everything to the middle of the country. And let me tell you, I drove through Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Colorado, Utah, parts of California. I mean, there were times when I'd go hours looking at windmills along the highway, and they're either not moving or they're barely moving. And I found a news article that this was a little while ago. Those companies, the wind energy companies, in 2016, they were subsidized to around the tune of $176 billion. That's a waste of resources and just a needless loss of the best resource we do have, like diesel, and more broadly petrol, because I mean, there's also diesel made from biomass. And I guess while I'm on it, quick funny thing about biomass is that if you were to have the same number of people die from nuclear energy as die from biomass pollution every year, you'd have to have a Chernobyl every single day. So when people complain about nuclear energy, they really have no idea what they're complaining about. But my point is, yeah, the government drives environmental problems. It drives food issues. I mean, I can cover the Federal Reserve too at some point, but a good example of what I'm getting at, and I'm not saying that the food crisis in the Middle East is fabricated, but considering all of the factors is something that can be a little bit daunting. And I only say that because I think about like the Irish potato famine, and people think of that as, a time when crops were doing terrible, the potato was, just it wasn't yielding like it should, and the Irish people were just, they wouldn't eat anything but potatoes or whatever. But the truth of the matter was, the government was taking the beef and the grains and everything else, all the other food that the Irish were producing, and they were exporting it. And there should have never been a famine. That was something that was largely brought on by the government. And I mean, that's just one example. But I mean, we talk about food issues in the Middle East, and I mean, things are just so corrupt over there. It's like when you look at Mexico, and it's like, well, Mexico's run terribly, but I mean, it's a state run by thugs. And that's a lot of what the Middle East is. So they're only out for themselves. They see all of the individual people as just cogs in the state machine, just minions, and just resources to be expended. And I mean, that's pretty much how I see it, I guess.
Yeah, and then maybe you'll even be more effective if you're allowed to choose your own career and you don't know you're in the prison. If you can choose your own career and what you really want to do, you could earn more tax revenue because you like what you're doing. You're not at the end of a whip being forced to do something you don't want to do. We could take that a million directions, I mean, crazy times. But hey, I had a question about the windmills where you were mentioning the over $170 billion for subsidy. Was that for the actual price on the kilowatt hour that was being subsidized, or was that subsidies for the manufacturer and the install or something? Do you have any breakdown on the numbers of where the actual money went to, into which was it generation or was it actually installation? Do you know about that?
Yeah, I found the article here. It says of the $176 billion provided to the wind energy sector, $2.9 billion came from the local and state governments, $9.4 from federal grants, tax credits. The rest was provided in federal loans or loan guarantees, and it just went to General Electric. It went to the individual companies, They had NextEra Energy, General Electric, Mid-American Energy Company. So, yeah, it seems like it just got doled out to the individual energy companies.
Yeah, I got doled out to the companies that had lobbyists to go to Washington. You got to be kidding me. GE, they're
Yeah.
one of the largest companies on the planet, yet they're still asking for money to install wind. You mean they didn't make it efficient enough for it to run and generate its own ROI on a payback at some point? How is it that we could still be subsidizing multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations that are really some of the largest on the planet? And they're trying to provide us with stuff that doesn't even work? This is ridiculous. These are the types of things that should be questioned and that you should be asking lawmakers about themselves, because you talk about this indentured servitude that you're in the Middle East, that they're being sold as minions in to keep the government structure going. It's no different here. I mean, you got to be kidding me if anybody's deluding themselves thinking that, oh, we're the best out here and we're just hiding and we're the only ones that do it and we're cool and everybody else is minions and we're not. That's exactly what the powers that be want you to think, so they can keep you trapped in this invisible, barless prison.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about squeezing the breath out of an industry and then having to socialize it, and then now the government's running it. They control healthcare. They control. I mean, it's basically trying to take over all the aspects of your life that make it your life.
Yeah, that's crazy. Hey, I wanted to talk about soils for a second. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Hamaker's work. Now, Dr. Hamaker talked the exact same things that you're talking about with the depletion of soils, and he goes into the glaciation cycles, through full-blown glaciation cycles into the interglacial, the interstatal, and then back into the glacial cycle again. And he talks about right after we exit a full-on blown glacial cycle, since there weren't glaciers, everything has been remineralized, if you will. Granite and other rocks have been crushed into powder and mixed with the soils, so when these glaciers recede, plus the water that's running off, these lands are so fertile. This is some of the most fertile lands you'll ever get to. And then as we go through, 8, 10, 12,000 years, then the topsoils are getting blown off. And Dr. Hamaker's work was also talking about the size of the trees reduces. There's more infestation of insects because plants just aren't as healthy. You alluded to that as well with the human system. But he was talking about remineralizing the soil using granite dust. Really, just that simple. No pesticides, no herbicides, granite dust. Something so simple that can be added right back in the soil that would double and triple yields. And it's supposedly magic. I have heard from people who were using it. But that's a solution as well when you talk about all these unmineralized or demineralized soils that are across the planet. Just seems like it's the timing of we're kind of at the end of an interglacial anyway, so it fits within that couple thousand years of the end of that, of the middle part between glaciations where the soils get worn down. So where are we going to go? The temperatures are going to drop and the rainfall's not in the same place as it used to be. It's either mega floods over here, like India got 4.5 times of the rain this season than the average for the season. And then other places, total bone dry drought that haven't seen rain in a year. So, this whole agricultural system here, we got the soils, we got the rainfalls, and then they still want to subsidize windmills or something. I don't get it. Maybe we could subsidize let's say research on indoor vertical farming or something that would save our species here during this squeeze point. Ben?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly areas, like if you're going to put subsidies somewhere, like if the government just has to put them somewhere, there's certainly better places to put them than these energy forms that just aren't giving any kind of decent ROI. And I think that there's really something to be said about the climate changes over time, because I was looking into this, and if you go back to like the 1000s, the 1100s, it was significantly warmer then than it is now. And I mean, you had there were vineyards going up into northern England and Scotland, and they were growing wheat in Iceland. I mean, they were growing wheat in Iceland. That's insane to think about. And I mean, the way that things have shifted over just centuries, it's the kind of thing that I don't think people ever really think about when you see a graph and it's just, the last 100 years, last 150 years. It's like, no, how about you go the last 1500 years? And people have this very strange, I guess, fear of CO2. And it's like, let's just buy the global warming narrative for a second. Okay, let's say that the Earth is warming. That's a good thing because you have to think of the planet like an economy. I mean, okay, so you have banks that take money from people, or like the people store the money in the bank, and then the banks invest that money with the hopes of multiplying that wealth, because wealth it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, we got out of that jungle mentality a long time ago where if you gain something, it's because someone else had to lose it. And when money is being invested and wealth is being multiplied, it keeps the economy moving, and a stagnant economy is bad. And we have all this carbon, which is part of the Earth's economy, that's trapped in fossil fuels. And I mean, I'm not advocating for massive fossil fuel use, but I am saying that the alarm bells concerning global warming are only being raised by the people who don't even understand climate change. When CO2 levels rise, there are more plants, and as a result, more animals that come into being. And this means that more of the sun's energy is utilized for life on Earth rather than just soaking into the soil or reflecting back into the atmosphere. And there were also times when the amount of CO2 on Earth was far higher and the Earth was colder than it is now. So CO2 clearly isn't the single factor, but you have environmentalists who make this their key point, and like CO2 is the only thing to worry about. We need the carbon tax. And we should welcome more CO2 in the atmosphere. I mean, we should welcome warmer temperatures. I mean, obviously to a certain degree, and there's no indication. It'll just keep increasing without stopping. But the cold times in the Earth's history are a time of famine and just huge losses of life. I mean, evidence of global warming has been faked in the past. People are paid to find certain results. Look at the Paris Climate Accord. That data was garbage. But people are paid to find these results. They're not just paid to assess what the truth is. They have to justify their own research. So if global warming is true, great. Carbon taxes and mass outcry is not the solution. Removing subsidies is, I think, more along the lines of the answer. And, allowing the energy market to operate freely and just without any regulation other than basic non-aggression principles. I mean, if you start putting these legislative strangleholds on the market, it's dangerous because of how important energy is to people. When you start messing with that market, you're putting people's lives at risk by removing back pressure on the market through favorability, subsidies, certain targeted legislation, all of that. And it skews innovation in the energy market because there's not that back pressure. And these innovations can make it more accessible for people and cheaper. And they can discover new energy resources, because something I've recently thought quite a bit about and heard some people speak about is, what are resources? Well, they're natural entities that people have adapted to be useful. So I wish that global warming was true. I don't particularly think it's true beyond question, but the solar cycles need to be examined. And I've seen no self-identified environmentalist even hint at the effect that the sun has on our climate. And it's a bit concerning to me. I mean, when you see the crop insurance claims in the northern US and, all across Europe and Asia, it's clear that there's something going on that people in the mainstream are not explaining clearly. And when you look at like the Chinese Communist Party's move into agriculturally rich areas, I mean, it's clear they're not expecting to just get these crops back on the mainland of China next year or the year after that, or likely for many years. And with importing so much food, it would be more than worth their time to just take some Chinese Communist Party members, send them to agriculturally rich areas, and then have them send the food back cheap. I mean, Venezuela, which we've talked about before, is two birds with one stone. Or, well, okay, it's really three birds with one stone. I mean, they have oil, they have agricultural land, and they have living space. and the Chinese Communist Party can have oil for basically free from them, thanks to those crack oil for money deals that I've discussed in the past that they've made with the government of Venezuela. I mean, that's why you don't nationalize energy. And they're constantly trying to expand. The Chinese Communist Party is constantly trying to expand. Look at what they're doing in Australia. Like I've talked about that before, and really I could rant about China for a while, but my big point is that global warming isn't what it's cracked up to be. If it was, then it's good. I mean, I wouldn't believe that unequivocally for several reasons, but I'd also like to address some of the anecdotal evidence from when I was recently, like I was saying, above the 45-degree latitude line in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, whatnot, because I saw quite a bit that really solidified of what a lot of what you've been saying and a lot of what I've been reading about before I actually went on this trip. And what I noticed is if you go into Utah, it's just desert in Utah. There was obviously nothing growing there other than other than like desert plants. But when you get into Montana, Oregon, Washington, even Northern California, there are plants that were once green that are now dead, like newly dead. And there's clearly something going on, and being able to see the symptoms allows you to just begin to diagnose the disease. And the disease, like some people might think, is not people. It's not even, I really actually wouldn't even classify it as a disease. It's a cycle that people have to prepare for and be told about. I mean, people, their lifespan isn't long enough to really get a grasp on some of these huge solar cycles, like the 400-year cycles. So they have to be told about what's going on, and we have the technology to do it. It's just that the mainstream and the government and so many different research agencies aren't doing it. They're just not addressing the root issue. I mean, the sun will do way more to the earth than humans.
Yeah, Ben, could I jump in with a thought there?
Yeah.
So you have to think about it. And the first thing that they've done, this global movement of the mainstream media and paid for academic science that's trying to prove something to get their grant funding, it was to lock us into this. Our entire, I guess, climate of the earth has been reduced down to 50 years or less. Because almost anybody you talk to and you say, well, since the satellite record temperature began, and that's where they've boiled it down to is, they rarely go back over 100 years in any of A, the news articles, B, when they're trying to explain something. They always talk about the era of, after World War II, or mainly since the 1970s when we had satellite record data. But they do not ever want you to go back into those multi-centuries. How about millennia? You talked about the wine vineyards in the UK, etc. That was a very abundant time. That was an apex of society. These cold times come in and we squeeze and we go into the dark ages and things contract. I mean, everything contracts. Population of the planet, economy, invention, art, literature, it all contracts. There's just too much worried about trying to get food on your plate. But they've completely squeezed us into this very, very short time to think about. Every climate debate's very short amount of time. We never go back and talk about the Younger Dryas, 11,500 years ago or so, when temperatures dropped 10 degrees Celsius and then they rose just as quickly, like 10 degrees C rise in a decade or less. They don't want to ever talk about that because, they're talking about a tenth of a degree here or something, but a whole full 10 degrees Celsius so quickly. And you have to think about it. What if you knew? So my whole thing is these explorers that went out over the last, let's say 500 years ago, what they have told us is they destroyed, burned, chipped away, broke, or just dropped off the ship, everything that was not Christian related. See, I can't believe that. I believe more that they would have packed everything up and sent it back to the Vatican or other types of bodies at that time. Kings may have sent out private conquistadors to go look, but I believe they know the cycles. Now imagine if you were a world government body and you knew the squeeze point was coming right now. Like, how would you try to keep A, the continuity of government together, B, your power structure in the pyramid together, and then C, not panic everybody that they would cause artificial shortages before the actual real problem comes in about 2 to 3 years from now or less? How would you try to keep it all moving down without the wheels falling off before the real price rises come. And this is what I'm getting at is here. I think it's purposefully constructed to keep us with this news distraction in the media, getting us to fight each other in so many ways, shapes, and forms, to keep us completely distracted from what you're talking about and others are, this 400-year cycle in the sun that's going to squeeze our cultures. And I'll leave it there. I've been rambling.
Yeah, no, I think what I would do to start, well, I mean, I would remove subsidies immediately from any energy industry that's getting them, because everything should be on a level playing field. And I would make a point to make sure that people like at least see it on mainstream media. They see it, they're informed throughout media outlets about how to have, an indoor garden, how to grow their own food, how to really take care of themselves during a period where, you're going to have crop prices rise, or food prices rising. And tell people, if you can afford it, then okay, you can afford it. But if you can't, and you don't want to pay for it, then here's some other ways to do it. And obviously not everybody would be able to all pay the high rising food prices, but that's why you got to inform people. There's got to be some kind of, like, people have to be aware of any potential cliff in front of them that they might not see, regardless of how high that cliff is. And I mean, like, people might debate the severity of the grand solar minimum, they might debate the severity of global warming, all this different stuff, and that's okay to debate the severity of it, but you still have to have people educated about what to do when it comes in some fashion or form. And I guess if I ran a government, I'm trying to keep it together. I mean, I would do that, and I would probably look to, well, I mean, if you remove energy subsidies and whatnot, then you don't have that land growing corn for ethanol. It's now growing other food. And I don't know. I would probably see where the problem works out to there and make a decision going forward from there. But yeah.
Yeah, that brings me to the point there you mentioned. You hit the nail on the head. The rising food prices when a segment of population cannot afford it. So let's think about any country. It doesn't have to be the U.S. It could be anywhere. The bottom 10% of money earners in a country are going to be priced out of the market so quickly that they're only going to resort to social upheaval to try to get food, because even with the EBT program or some kind of subsidy here in the U.S., if your food prices double or triple, even with EBT cards, it's still not going to be enough to cover basic necessities. So if you're talking about unemployed, underemployed, people who are relying on subsidies from government, they're not going to be able to make it when these food prices rise up. So then what are they going to do? And that might be part of the reason, for the police state buildup over these last, almost 20 years now, due to the fact that they could have blamed it on terrorism and 9/11, etc. But what if truly that was just a mask, a cover for putting the police state in place, because they knew all of these social upheaval events would happen when the food prices skyrocket and these lower segments of society can't afford it. They're going to be the first ones to get tweaked and start throwing fists and Molotov cocktails. There's a method behind the madness, and I really have I don't know. I'm starting to see through a lot more things lately.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that was one of the concerns with the Middle East when all of this, I mean, over the last probably decade, was that it was the global warming crowd making this argument, but it was as global warming gets worse and things, the climate gets worse and there's food shortages and all of this, which doesn't really make sense because food shortages don't line up with global warming. But they were saying that these kind of resource scarcities in the Middle East will lead to more terrorism because people will be fighting over resources, back to the jungle mentality. And I mean, people are living beings. They resort to that kind of thing when they're placed in a life or death scenario. I mean, it's tough. It's a very tough situation to be in.
Yeah, the changes in the sun, the vibration frequency changing as well. People behaving differently. Not only are there more cosmic rays, but the actual energy density coming off of our sun is a little bit different with the UV changes, etc. You feel like people are just spinning out of control. Things just seem suddenly different you just can't put your finger on it. What's going wrong? But everywhere you look, there's something weird or strange or bizarre happening. And a lot of people are trying to put their finger on it, and they can't just put it on a single event. It seems to be literally in the air around you. I don't know if you feel the vibrational changes. There is so much change happening, and old systems are trying to cling to a new frequency they can't hold on to. It's like the worlds are splitting here. It's an incredible feeling to witness, as well as to see it unfolding and know the reasons why it's unfolding. This is an important part of it.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And it's great to see a channel like yours covering more of the climate side of things and things going on in that front. And, I'm covering more on the media front, but it's all about getting people educated and just uncovering the truth of things and getting to the bottom of a lot of the crack climate scientists and whatnot that are out there just trying to, get their next research grant. And I mean, there's so much corruption. There's the swamp. I mean, it's on all fronts. There's just dead wood that needs to be burned off.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, you said you traveled out west and it took a little bit of time going out through the farmlands. Did you have a chance to talk to any farmers, and did they know about the grand solar minimum, or are they talking about the weather's being strange? I mean, what did you hear in the farmlands as you were traveling through? I know you talked with a fair few people, so what were the reports on the ground literally about these changes that are being seen across the planet, but more locally in those states that you went through?
Yeah, so I talked with a guy in Colorado who's lived there for, he said, the last like 40 or so years, and he's probably early 40s maybe, I don't know, around that. I didn't get his actual age, but he looked to be about early 40s. So he was saying that he's noticed that over the last, and he wasn't a farmer, he's just a guy who's lived there for 4 decades, but he was saying that he's noticed that the glaciers up on the mountain seem to have deteriorated over the last 40 years. And what was interesting to me was to notice that Colorado is below the 45-degree latitude line, and it seems like the average temperature in Colorado is going up, but the problem is they're also having more of a drought issue in certain parts of Colorado, specifically southern Colorado. And yeah, I mean, so I talked to that guy. So I talked to the guy in Colorado, and when I was up in Washington, I met with a farmer, and I was talking with him, and I actually contacted him through email, and he was saying that I brought up the grand solar minimum. He said he wasn't really aware of it. So, I mean, I told him, what I knew about it at the time, and he was basically saying that there's more of a need now for crop insurance, or there's more crop insurance claims really coming out. And I mean, the farmers, like it's not like they don't talk to each other. They obviously do. There's even some states that have farm unions. So, I mean, they're pretty in tune to what's going on with other farms. And I mean, you've had dairy farms shut down. That was remarkable to me that there were dairy farms that were shutting down. I think that was in Montana. And I think it's been like it was either 300 or 500 since the beginning of the year. Or no, sorry. It was 100 since the beginning of the year that have just shut down. And I mean, you have to wonder, like, it's the dairy industry, but the cows still have to eat the grass that's around them, and the farmers still have to get feed for them. And it's like, when it's not worth it anymore, people just don't do it. And I mean, farms of all types are struggling out in that area of the country, and it's pretty evident just driving through just driving on the highways, the interstate highways, because you can see so much just dead plant material, and then you have, little, like I was saying, little patches of green.
Yeah, I talked to Anita Bailey, and she was saying the same thing. Anybody who was raising cattle, they couldn't afford it anymore because they were trucking in hay from other states to try to feed these animals, and it became too cost prohibitive because of droughts or floods. It's both. It's not just one or the other. But she said there's an enormous amount of flood of new cattle going into the beef market. So beef prices may appear to be going down at the moment, counterintuitive to what you think. But the reason the prices are going down is what you just said. People are selling off their herds. They can't afford to keep them anymore. And there's this glut at the moment. But you got to realize behind that, there's at least 3 years of shortages now in any types of cattle, because these heifers, by the time they bear children and you raise those up to where they're even producing milk, or they're going to be, large enough to take for meat, slaughter. I mean, you're looking at years for this. Now everybody's just selling all their mature animals down into slaughterhouses or off to other farmers that are, what we consider mega farms. So the average small farmer is selling off all their herds at the moment. Now I heard goat farmers are doing quite well because goats are easy to keep. They just kind of eat anything and are they produce milk, and they'll eat literally kudzu as well. They love kudzu. So that's where it kind of gets at it. And if I think about that now, if all these herds are sold off, dairy, what's it going to come to when there's no more of these larger animals to either get meat for or get milk from? Where do we go now? What's the next step down then? Are we going to use llamas? Am I going to get llama milk or something? I mean, where does it go? We're going to all convert over to goat milk? I mean, is that the direction it's going to go, with unstable grow patterns for fields full of, hay? Are we going to move to goats, and then we're going to have a goat milk-based society like they do in the Middle East or other parts of the world? I'm not sure, but you're seeing it as well, the selling off of the herds.
Yeah, I wouldn't be totally shocked if we move away from cow milk, because the thing with cows too that I forgot to mention earlier is that they consume huge amounts of water, and when you have them out in on the western half of the U.S., they just don't have that kind of water. Like they're going through a drought period, and I think for every pound of beef, it's roughly 5 gallons of water that it took to get that pound of beef. And cows drink some insane amount of gallons per day. I forget, it's around like 50 gallons a day or something. It's insane. And I mean, when you have that kind of extra expense, you're going to have people just closing up shop, and that market is going to move somewhere else. And I mean, goat milk is something, but I don't know. I think largely people are just going to have to start doing without luxuries that they're used to, or not even luxuries, but like non-necessities that they're used to having. And I don't know, I think as a whole we're going to see that in quite a few different industries. But
you heretic, Ben, you heretic. People are not going to psychologically be able to stay with it if they can't get their fix of instant gratification. OMG. What's going to happen? People are going to start freaking if they can't get goods, Talk about rationing, the big R word. Oh no. What's going to happen if they're rationing anything? People are absolutely psychologically going to freak out because they've never dealt with it even once in their life. It's been multi-generations. We've never had to deal with this in the States. Europe, a little bit different. They've dealt with the rationing, World War II, and then after, and it's kind of still within a grandparent or a third generation back. People have been used to rationing, even up into the 50s, 60s. But in the States, we haven't had that. What is going to happen when we start rationing food? People are going to freak, and I don't even know what's going to kick off the rationing, but it's going to be something just like this. People are not going to be used to or even accept that they can't get thing A, B, or C. That's not even an option to not have it. There's going to be a lot of psychological problems moving forward with the scarcity as well. Or it could be abundance, depending on if you can provide that service or that good. You could have, you could be right in the center of it. And that's where your value play is and where your opportunity is. If something disappears in one place, what can you provide or, bring together as a service, or what value can you get so people can maybe get something close to that back again?
Yeah, I mean, one of the industries that I'm looking at pretty closely, just waiting for it to collapse and for people to freak out, is the auto industry. I mean, can you imagine if people actually had to pay the market price for cars? You would have such an incredibly small percentage of people compared to what it is now that would actually be able to afford a car. And one of the issues when you have that kind of subsidizing of an industry like that, and this is just the auto industry for an example, what ends up happening is you have people who are now able to work farther away from home, and then they're using up more gas to get to work, and the government's building the roads, and all of this stuff is subsidized, and there's no market back pressure. And I think that you're going to see multiple industries start to really struggle as like the legs get kicked out from under these industries, and those legs would be the subsidies and the tax dollars that just get funneled to these programs in these industries. And I don't know, that the legs are going to get kicked out, and people are going to have to face reality. And I don't think it'll be necessary. I think there will certainly be things that are a necessity that go up in price, but I think what people are really going to start to miss are the cars and the more luxury items.
Yeah, you talked about a basic necessity item there. Rainfall is illegal to harvest in some states. Example, Oregon, you went up through there. It's illegal for you to harvest rainwater off the roof because they say that actually drains down into a basin that then they can charge water rights for. And by you just collecting that off your roof, they've already allotted those number of square yards or square meters into the rainfall or the rainflow and the rainfall runoff and drainage count per cubic meter that you're actually stealing from the state because they can't sell that. So when you're talking about even outlawing the most basic of the basic, when you talk about food and water and air, water is number two. You don't breathe for 5 or 6 minutes, you'll die, but you don't drink water for 3 days, you're going to die. Food, you can go weeks. It's crazy that the second most important thing for human existence itself is now deemed illegal to even pull off of your own private property. Oh, wait, it's not really private property because you have to pay the property tax every year, and if you don't do that, they'll put a lien on your home, so you don't really own anything. But it's interesting to go back to the point of what else are they going to make illegal that's of your basic necessity? Are you not going to be able to grow your own food? Because we've seen these ratings with the FBI SWAT teams in organic milk farms and other kinds of farming areas, or whenever they get too big to start to really supply themselves and have an overabundance of food where they can sell in markets and they're starting to make a lot of money, it seems they get closed down magically. But these are the leaders of the community. We should be learning from them on how to expand our agriculture. But yeah, I don't know. What are we going to do when they start, saying that you can't even grow your own food? Will that be illegal? Will they have to get all your food from a government warehouse somewhere? Like, you can only do that when you can't grow your own because you can't harvest your own rainwater now. So where does it lead us? There's going to be more control coming down the pike as we get deeper into these crop losses, possible rationing in the future, for sure, increases through everything. Inflation, people are going to stop spending to go to movies and restaurants. If your food's more, you're just going to stay at home. You're going to spend more on food. So I can see a lot more, rules, shall we say, in the future as this thing starts to get more serious in these next coming months and years.
Yeah, I mean, as the government just tries to gain more control over the resources that are really the lifeblood of humanity, like they're trying to take control of carbon with carbon taxes. They're trying to, they're trying to take control of the energy industries that, I mean, if you got rid of the energy industries, there would be millions upon millions of people that would die. And when you have the government taking that over, now they're controlling that. And then you have the government taking over healthcare. It's like that's what they do. They try to move in and take over that which is most essential to the society. And it's not surprising at this point. I mean, looking back on history, that's like, I think back to Venezuela, and one of the biggest mistakes, I mean, they made a lot of mistakes, don't get me wrong, but one of the biggest was nationalizing oil. Because I understand why they did it, but there were a lot of better options, and all the better options include the free market. So, well, thanks for having me, Dave. I got to get going, but thank you very much for having me on your radio show. I really appreciate it. This was great to get to talk to you, bounce some ideas off you. I feel like it's been forever since we talked, because I mean that was since before I went out west. So this was nice to catch up and exchange ideas.
Yeah, I see that your 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 attitude has changed about the grand solar minimum and the government intervention and the news deflections. So good to get a chance to chat again. Yeah, now remember, if you want to check out more of Ben's commentary, ideas, political analysis, the Right Media YouTube channel. And Ben, where else can they find you?
I'm on Twitter at Ben's Politics. I have BitChute. It's just the Right Media, and therightmedia.org, which is going to be revamped here soon.
Great. Thanks for your time. And I'm going to continue on the solo show here. I am going to talk about this new report that came out, The Alternative Influence Broadcasting the Reactionary Right on YouTube from Data and Society. You know, that report that came out and showed the list of 31 other conservative voices they want to silence on YouTube because they say they're selling alternative opinions. I'm going to get into this. We're going to dissect the PDF as we go forward tonight.